So our first question for our three speakers is just really chill. What makes a good interfaith conversation, in your opinion? Like, sort of, what are the ingredients for good interfaith dialogue? Chana, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is that you don't go in, well, firstly, the most important thing is respect, obviously, for everyone, everyone's opinions, the fact that people are representing their own views, and everyone's going to have different interpretations of things, and being sensitive to the fact that not everyone agrees on everything. But secondary to that, I think that it's important that everyone goes in with an understanding that it's just a snapshot, and you're not going to be an expert on the other person's experience of their faith by the end of the conversation. And likewise, no, you're not going to make anyone else an expert on your own experience. And I think that's an important way of kind of reducing it, because you've got to, in a sense, reduce your whole experience of religion and distill it into a short space of time, and that's obviously impossible. And I think it's important to kind of remember that, and for me at least, it helps hopefully stop me going off on too many tangents.
Awesome, thank you. Lizzy, do you want to jump on next?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with that, and especially obviously the coming at it with respect and understand that we all come from different viewpoints, and that when you're engaging with conversation with any person of faith, tends to be, we all have different expressions of faith and different ways that we understand our faith, even when we're the same denomination. So obviously recognizing that one person's view from one faith point of view doesn't mean that it's representative of the whole faith. And I think there's also something as well about openness to being challenged as well. And I think disagreeing respectfully with each other and being willing to hear those voices is really good, because often, I mean, I find this all the time, I'm quite blinkered sometimes with my ideas of what my faith means, and then it's actually other people from outside that faith that come and question it, that makes me actually question things, because sometimes you need that outside view. So I think being willing to be challenged in a respectful way and being willing to rethink your point of view as well is really important, and being open to that learning, I think is really, really key.
Yeah, I think the other two basically covered most things. So what I'd like to say is that, well, there's some things which definitely don't lead to interfaith conversation, and I think there are obviously the oppositions of being disrespectful, trying to generalize everyone, but also I think oftentimes when we are engaging in interfaith dialogue, when we begin, we're very polite and so on, and we are kind of almost, to jump on what Lizzy was saying as well, add on to that, we're almost reluctant and scared to disagree. We're scared to say, actually, because we're trying to build these connections, build these connections and so on, we don't want to say, actually, I don't agree with you on that aspect. I find that I think you're wrong, right? Obviously, you wouldn't say that. You find a right way of saying it. But I think we even shy away from that for the sake of building, keeping that community relation, for the sake of keeping that closeness. But at the end of the day, you could easily make the case that understanding our differences and really diving into our differences is just as important, if not more important, to building that community cohesion. And that's something which I find frustrating. But in the faith that we choose to do that, I think we need to do more of it. But we need to, like just in the back.
All right, thanks. Our next question, and we'll just go around in the same order, if that's okay, is what do you think the benefits of doing something like scriptural reasoning are as a tool for facilitating interfaith dialogue? And it might be good here, before I actually get you guys to answer this question, to just explain for everybody what scriptural reasoning is. I probably should have done that earlier, but we're here now. So scriptural reasoning is basically a type of interfaith dialogue. It involves bringing your religious texts sort of to the table in an interfaith context, and usually presenting a text that you've picked on a certain topic and talking about what that means to you. A lot of scriptural reasoning is sort of interpreting things from your personal perspective and using that as a sort of starting point for general dialogue, because it sort of gives you something to talk about. If you can be like, okay, so this is what my religious text says about this topic. And then it gives you something to ask questions about, like, oh, well, you mentioned this concept when you were explaining your text. Can you talk a little bit more about that? So it's basically a way to facilitate interfaith dialogue around specific subjects. Yeah, so that's what everybody will be doing tonight after we finish this little bit of the event. So yeah, if you guys want to go around again in the same order about, like, yeah, how do you find scriptural reasoning to be helpful as a tool of interfaith dialogue? Are there other tools you found that are also helpful?
So I haven't done scriptural reasoning before. I'm very excited for this, but I think it sounds as though it's a good way of sort of grounding you in the topic that you're trying to keep the discussion about, whilst at the same time, with interfaith dialogue, you're normally hearing the speaker express their own views, but when you're seeing a text that person has brought, you're also seeing a little bit of a window into maybe how other people of that faith or who relate to that text might experience it and might experience a conversation around that topic. I think that's really interesting. Also, I'm not so familiar with how everyone else relates to texts in their own experience of faith, but in Judaism, textual study is completely key to everything that we do, and all of our laws and all of our experiences are based in text, and textual study is a huge part of religious Judaism. I use the term religious Judaism to include like across denominations, but in particular in Orthodox Judaism, which is what I identify as, textual study is like something that's seen as something you should do on a daily basis. And so this idea of exploring topics through the way that text represents them is actually something that's quite relevant in Judaism, I think.
Awesome, thanks. That's really interesting to hear. Lizzy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, in much the same way, I've not done scriptural reasoning before, so this is my first experience of it. But the reason why I was so excited by it is partly because I think it roots our understanding within our faith context and within our religious texts, but with the idea being that we're still aware that we don't speak for everybody from our religious point of view and from our faith point of view, and people may disagree within the same faith as well. But it also gives you an opportunity to learn from other religious texts as well and see where the similarities are and where the differences are, and where we can start having that conversation around respectfully disagreeing or even respectfully agreeing with each other as well, and seeing where the roots intertwine and how that manifests differently within different texts and different religions, if that makes sense at all. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes great sense. Raahim?
I think in my experience, there have been two real benefits from engaging in scriptural reasoning. The first is that as people of faith, even as people of faith, I can say, we're often scared to engage with our scripture because 1,000 years old, 2,000 years old, we don't really understand what he's saying. But when you do, and it's not the same as a Jewish tradition, but you have to, when you're growing up, you are, engaging with scriptural reasoning, basically. But oftentimes people will read the Quran and not understand what it's saying. But when you use scriptural reasoning, pick up your topic, a particular story, whatever it might be, you're forced to engage with the text yourself. It is something otherwise, even within a Muslim context, you might not do. And as we were saying, when you dig with people of other faith, it helps you see the same text from other. You see how they're approaching it, and it's not necessarily a wrong way of approaching it. It might be a way that just shines a different light on the same verse or the same topic. The other thing is, I think, it's very much in the name of scriptural reasoning. We have lived in an era where I think reasoning faiths have often been considered to be contradictory. And hopefully, as we engage in scriptural reasoning, we'll see that actually there's a lot of logic to it. We try to apply logic to it. And when we fail to, the beginning of scriptural reasoning is the other person can call you out. Actually, I don't understand how you jump from A to B. What was their middle step? Especially if, because you have your own assumptions about your faith, which might not be explicit. And someone else who's not from your faith tradition will be able to spot that and actually challenge you. That doesn't necessarily mean your reasoning doesn't exist. It just means that you've not thought about it from first principles. You've kind of inherited it, but then it makes you almost relearn your faith, even after having lived in it for X amount of years. So I think that's a really good point.
I have something also to add that I just thought of. For a lot of us, we see our texts as divinely inspired or written by people who we hugely respect. And I think, and I don't know if tonight's topic is likely to bring that up at all, but sometimes there are texts where we might feel challenged. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's okay to feel challenged by texts within your own religion and also within other faiths, but it's much easier to dismiss a text that you find challenging that's not your own than when that text is something that you have been or believe in some way has either some divine inspiration or comes from someone who you're not willing to dismiss as a person altogether. And I just think it's worth sort of mentioning that as important when we're talking about texts.
I think that's great to bring up, Chana. Like also just the importance of, remembering that these are important for people even when they don't agree with what their own text says, is a really important part of the mutual respect that everybody's been talking about. All right, thanks guys, those were awesome answers. I think we'll get into our little mini scriptural reasoning, if that's okay with everyone. So I'm going to ask each of our three sort of panelists to read out a couple of verses or a short passage from religious text and talk for a little bit about sort of their interpretation of it. What about this jumps out to them? How is this important to them? And their understanding of how their faith responds to refugees. So we'll do that, and then we'll sort of open it up for everyone to ask questions and sort of try and dig into the text a little bit more. This is sort of a slightly nerdy tool of dialogue, so I hope everybody came with their like literary analysis hats on. All right. I feel bad making Chana go first again. So I will pick on Lizzy this time. You okay to go first, Lizzy?
I am. I might have done it slightly different to everybody else as well. I was saying before we started, because I've not done it before. I kind of came at it, I think, with a nerdy academic head on. So I think the first thing to be really open about is that in neither the Old or the New Testament, there is no mention of refugees in terms of the word refugee, although the theme of displacement is paramount throughout. So in the Old Testament, obviously, you have the Israelites fleeing Egypt. And then in the New Testament, you have Mary and Joseph and Jesus fleeing Herod as well. So displacement is key throughout both the Old and New Testament, as far as I understand, because like I said, can't speak for everyone, but that's how the first thing that I take away is the fact that displacement is a key theme of the Bible. And then how we act towards those who are displaced, I think is also a key. So while we don't talk about, the Bible doesn't talk about refugees, it does talk about strangers, sojourners, and foreigners. And then so I've picked out kind of a few key pieces of text where I think the Bible speaks to me about how we should treat refugees. And the first theme, this is definitely analysis head on. I've kind of coded it, I guess, in terms of PhD talk. The first one I picked out was Leviticus 19:33-34, which is, don't mistreat any foreigners who live in your land. Instead, treat them all as you treat citizens and love them as much as you love yourself. Remember, you were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And really bringing out what challenges me there is the fact that it's telling us to love foreigners exactly as we would love ourselves. So that calling of the fact that, And I think this goes back to other themes within the Bible that I've kind of brought out in other areas as well, where we're told to love people. We're all made in the image of God. Our neighbour is everyone, those themes, and the idea that we shouldn't separate people just because they aren't necessarily from our own countries. The other theme I picked out was feeding the stranger and showing hospitality to the stranger and how important that is. So Hebrews 14:2 talks about, do not forget how to show hospitality to strangers. By doing so, some people have shown hospitality to the angels without knowing it. And similarly, there are other parts of the text where it talks about the fact that whenever you feed the hungry or so whenever you welcome a stranger, you're welcoming Jesus. And that's a core part of what it's like to be a disciple of Jesus. So again, really challenging me that part of my faith is about the fact that I need to be showing that welcome, and actually that's part of being godly. And although I don't think any of us ever live up to that completely, because we're all human, actually that's what we're called to do. And then one of the final things that I was thinking about was the fact that in the Bible, people aren't always happy to be strangers in a strange land, though. So Psalms 137, 4-6 talks about the Jews mourning what they've lost and how they're foreigners in a foreign land, and how can we sing about the Lord? Jerusalem, if I forget you, let my right hand go limp, let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth, if I don't think about you above all else. And within that, I think that feeds into a wider conversation sometimes that we forget to have when we talk about what the Bible says about refugees, which is this idea that we're called to be peacemakers as well, and that not everybody is going to be happy being a refugee within our country. Not when everyone's going to want to stay. While they might be happy to have hospitality here in a short space of time, actually, we should also be looking at a longer term picture and working for peace, so that people who want to return home are able to. While also making a hospitable home here for those people who want to stay or those people who are here short term. So I guess I kind of looked at it at both a long and short term vision. But yeah, I had lots of other pieces of text, but I'm very aware it's 25 minutes. So I'm happy to return to them at any point later on if people want to talk about them.
I think, yeah, thanks, Lizzy. We probably will come back to them at some point. But I think for right now, I kind of want to hear what Chana has to say, because you did quote some passages that are from the Torah. Yeah. So I'm really interested.
Yeah.
So you gave me loads more to think about just there. That was really interesting. Thank you. So just firstly, in very, very brief, the way that Judaism relates to texts is we use the word Torah to refer to two things. Either it can be referring to all Jewish texts that have ever existed and all study of them as a broad category, or it can specifically refer to the 5 books of Moses, which are our foundational texts. That's what we believe, or Orthodox Jews believe, was divinely given. It was written by God, and that it's kind of like the things that are in there are kind of where everything else is based off of. So I also wrote down the same quote from Leviticus, Vayikra, and also in a couple of other places where the Torah mentions that the way that one is supposed to treat the ger, I won't translate that for a second, the ger, because you yourselves were gerim, that's ger in the plural, in Egypt. So the foundation of the Jewish people comes from the story of the Jews were slaves in Egypt, and then they were led out of Egypt by Moses and given the Torah. And so the foundation of Jewish nationhood and peoplehood comes from that becoming that exiting that persecution, and that refugee status turning into an ownership status and a not ownership, that's not the right word, but having their self-identity and the connection to the land of Israel, and that becomes their kind of new spiritual home. And so all of these reminders in the Torah about treat strangers in this way because I just translate it as strangers. Treat gerim in this way because you were gerim is really important. So Lizzy, you mentioned the different terms in the Old Testament, strangers, sojourners, foreigners. And a lot of those are in the Hebrew as ger. And this is an issue we come into whenever we're translating like texts in Hebrew and Aramaic, is obviously some things get lost in translation. And when a word has multiple meanings, when you translate it, you've got to pick one of those meanings. And that can change the context of the phrase. So I found a really interesting source sheet that brought a lot of these texts and translated the word ger, not as stranger or sojourner or foreigner, but as migrant. And they gave an explanation as to why they had done that at the beginning of this text. And what they brought was, there's also, again, multiple times throughout the Torah, there is reference to you shall, for example, this is a quote also from Leviticus from 24, you shall have one standard of law for migrant and citizen alike, for I, the Lord, am your God. And again, that kind of thing is mentioned over and over again. And there's also, we see the ger, the migrant, grouped together with orphans and widows and those in slavery several times, and with other people who experience poverty and discrimination several times. And so this person had pointed out that there seems to be this concept in the Torah that the ger is vulnerable to discrimination, and therefore we need to be reminded multiple times over to treat that person with respect and with empathy, and to draw on our own experiences to do so. And I think it's this interesting parallel between this ideal world that the Torah is trying to create. You should treat the stranger, you know, as one of your own, and also addressing the reality that really, like, we see the fact that people who are migrants don't always fit in and don't always have it easy. And we're accepting that reality in order that we can make those changes. So that was kind of like a lot of background texts that I brought, but the specific text that I really wanted to share with you is from the Mishnah, which is the first like codification of Jewish law, like written down codification of Jewish law that we had post Torah, from around the like 1st to 5th centuries. And this is from the Mishnah in Pesachim, which talks about the Passover Seder and how we're supposed to conduct ourselves on Passover. And so it's discussing the ritual and the order of the evening. And it goes as follows. After they pour a second cup of wine, a child asks his father, and the father explains from a passage, then it quotes a passage about my father was a wandering Aramean, which is describing how, like, going way back to the story of Jacob, how he was forced out of his father's home and like essentially became a refugee, till the end of that passage. And then it says, in every generation, a person must regard themselves as though they personally have gone out of Egypt. As it is said, and you shall tell your child on that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. And this is something that has practical ramifications. It's seen as you haven't fulfilled the commandment to observe the laws of Passover if you don't like describe yourself as having left Egypt. And certain Jewish communities take this to the extent of they dress up with bags on their back and they walk around the table, and they literally reenact the scene of leaving Egypt. And we're also commanded to remember having left Egypt every single day. So this idea of having this like memory, foundational memory of being Jewish, being rooted in this idea of being somewhere where you're oppressed and having to leave that place, is really key to like the way that we understand the world. And it's something that has sort of been repeated throughout history. Jews in so many countries have faced persecution for being Jewish throughout millennia. But in particular, for the Jews of European descent, which is most of the Jews in the UK, we're very like collectively scarred from the events of the Holocaust. And I'm descended from a Holocaust survivor. Like everyone I know like knows people who are Holocaust survivors. And it's something that like had a huge impact on the mentality of various Jewish communities and the way that people relate to the world. And it can have like, different people react in different ways to that. I know that like when I see my grandmother like reading anything about asylum seekers and refugees, like it distresses her when she sees people unwilling to welcome them in the same way that she was welcomed as a child to this country. But likewise, like in some cases, it makes people much more insular and unwilling to trust others who are coming from outside, because they still feel that they need it as a priority to protect themselves and to protect their family. And I think it's interesting how that mentality of that experience of being oppressed, of being different, kind of persists throughout generations. And Lizzy, you mentioned the fact that like the Jews of Babylon pining for Israel, that's still, even today, like that's something that still goes on. Since Israel, the state of Israel was founded in 1948, that was like a huge impact on the Jewish world, because Jews had spent 2,000 years dreaming of that, and we say it in our prayers multiple times a day, and it's a reality that we don't even see as fully fulfilled, because we don't have the temple that we used to have 2,000 years ago. And just, yeah, I think it's interesting like ways that collective mindset affects generations. And I've spoken for way too long, so I'm going to shut up now, sorry.
It's fine. It was really interesting to hear about how this sort of Jewish mindset of remembering being a refugee, being a migrant, is like rooted in the Mishnah, in like law. That's really cool, because I didn't know about that. Raahim, do you want to finish us off?
So firstly, something that Chana was saying really caught my interest, if that's not the right phrase, but it's the idea of reenacting the journey out of Egypt, and almost as if I wanted to touch on the spiritual dimension of that a little bit, and specifically what I'm going to talk about is migration, and how the Prophet and his early companions were migrants. They were refugees, right? But once that migration had finished, many years later, someone asked him, what is the best kind of immigration, right? What's the kind of, it's called hijrah in Arabic, right? And actually the Muslim calendar starts from when hijrah started, the year of hijrah, from Mecca to Medina, because that's how important it was in the history of Islam. But someone asked him, what is the best immigration at later point, at the point that physical immigration had cut off, possibly. And he says the best immigration is to leave what Allah dislikes and leave what God dislikes. So he's adding a spiritual dimension to it. It's not just that there are people who, left their families, left their wealth, left their homes for the sake of Islam, moved to Medina, right? There were like a couple of hundred of them. But then he's saying, actually, the hijrah continues. You can still make hijrah even though you went from the generation, by leaving that which God dislikes, traveling from God's displeasure to God's pleasure. So that's the spiritual dimension, which I think is somewhat reflected in the journey of constantly being on a journey to God, which perhaps the journey out of Egypt, of the children of Israel kind of represents as well. I've spoken for a minute and a half. Okay, right. I have slides to share, and I will definitely not get through them. So I'm going to talk as much as I can to one or two of those slides, but this very beautifully colorly coded slide is the one I want to talk about primarily. This talks about how the immigrants from Mecca were received by the people of Medina. The people of Medina are called the Ansar, the helpers. And I just want to highlight a few things, and I'm not going to go through the Arabic because we don't have time, but it says that when these people came to them, they literally, this is God speaking from the Islamic point of view, that he said that he testifies that these people have a love for the people who come to them. Like when we think about immigrants coming to us, the immigrants, where are they going to live? These people didn't just love them. The Prophet set up a particular system where voluntarily these people would share their homes with these people, share their wealth. If one of them died, one of the Ansar of Medina died, the migrant, the Muhajir from Mecca would inherit from him. That system was abolished later on once the Muslims became a bit more stable, but that system was created, and there's much more depth to it to kind of create this brotherhood. It's called the Pact of Brotherhood. In fact, each person from Mecca was given a brother from Medina. One brother died, the other inherited, right? To the extent that some of them had more than one wife, right? And they would divorce one of their wives so that this person who left his family, who might not be Muslim, who might be persecuting him, could have a wife, could have a family of his own. That's the extent, right? Okay, we can talk about the ethics of that another time, but this is what they were willing to sacrifice. They were willing to sacrifice what was dearest to them. And the Quran highlights that in this verse. I know it in Arabic, so walau kana bihim khasasa, they give preference to what they would like them for themselves, even if they have a need for it, they still give. And there's a beautiful story, I'll put it down here in the notes, but basically the story goes that this person came, he wanted some food, he asked the Prophet, I need food, basically he's one of the Muhajir. And then the Prophet said, unfortunately, I don't have food, can anyone else feed him? And this couple took him in, but they only had enough food for like their children, enough food for them. And what the story is down there, but in summary, they ended up feeding this person, turning off the lights so he didn't feel embarrassed that they weren't eating, but he was eating. And then this verse is said to have come down, this verse in honor of this couple, which sacrificed their own need, not just a desire, their need for someone who was in need, right? So that's one thing. That's all welcoming migrants, right? Welcoming those in need. There's another aspect I want to talk about, is the aspect of migration and earth and borders and politics and all that. And when we look at it from a Quranic perspective, and if we look at it historically as well, the world we have today, nation state, I'm an IELTS graduate, so I'm obviously going to talk about this. It wasn't always the way it was today. And it doesn't mean that before was better. It might have been worse in some places. But it also doesn't mean that that's what the Quranic world is. When God speaks about the earth, he says that it's for everyone, it's for all living beings. He says, anam. Anam is like every single thing that sleeps. Literally comes from the word from Noam, the word for sleep. Everything that sleeps, animals, the birds, etc. The earth is for them, right? And borders are sort of construction, but that doesn't mean, you can just go rock up at someone's house and say, God gave the earth to everyone, therefore I'm going to stay here. Islamic law is very strict about, you can't pray on usurped land, for example. Your prayer is invalid if you pray on somewhere you're not allowed to be. But at the same time, God has given some people more than others to test them. There's a verse which I quoted down here in another chapter, that God has raised some people in what he has given them so that he might test them. Like, are you going to give? Are you going to be selfish? Are you going to keep it to yourself, etc. So if we put an Islamic ethic as a foundation, and I think this ethic will be shared with the other faiths, Abrahamic faith and other non-Abrahamic faiths, what we are given isn't for ourselves. We have our needs, right? But when it gets beyond our needs, again, similar verse to what Chana was talking about, give to the person who has a right on you. It's the poor person, it's the traveler who's in need. Other verses talk about, this verse talks about families, another verse talks about the person who's deprived, the person who might be disabled, right? It can be understood in many levels. So I'm almost done, but this is the kind of person Islam obligates you to help. The Quran obligates you to help. And at the end of the day, this migration happened because the early Muslims were persecuted. They were killed because of their faith by the people in Mecca, especially those who didn't have any level of tribal protection. So in summary, immigration is the center of the Islamic story, I think. I think that's immigration, migration, being a refugee, but it also has a spiritual dimension to it. And that's it basically. And I think I'm just 1 minute over.
That was remarkably brief for you, Raahim. I'm very proud of you. Because I know you had so many more things.
Smiling.
I knew you had so many more things you could have said. All right. So now that we've sort of had
development.
Very proud, very proud. Now that we've had a little bit from each of our three panelists, I'm just going to open it up for questions. Feel free to ask each other questions, and anyone else, feel free to ask our speakers questions. Just sort of go for it. If nobody has a question, I will start asking people things. So
I have a question for Raahim. I just wanted to know a bit more about the kind of spiritual side he was talking about, because it reminded me of one of the things that I looked at as well when I was thinking about this, was the fact that we're also told that that God doesn't have favourites and that he judges us all by what we do and for each other, and that we must honour God while also living as strangers here on earth, with the idea being that we are all, I guess in a sense as well, strangers in the fact that we live on earth but our heavenly home is different. So I wondered kind of what the crossover might be in terms of what Raahim was saying, and that kind of idea that we're all strangers on earth as well, with the spiritual aspect in terms of what we're working towards.
So one place where, as a Muslim, I would disagree with, I suppose, the Christian perspective is that God does have favorites. That doesn't mean he doesn't like others, but yes, God does choose some people over others. The prophets, for example, the Quran is very clear in Allah Adam wa Nuhan wa ala Ibrahim wa ala Imran. God chose Adam and Noah and the family of Abraham and the family of Imran, who's Amram, sometimes considered to be Moses' father, sometimes considered to be Jesus' granddad. But anyway, over the worlds, over the universes. So he does select people. So that's the first thing. In terms of the spiritual journey, I think there's a Shia text called Al-Asfar al-Arba'a. It's called The Four Journeys, right? And it's a really high level text. And I've not read it in Farsi or Arabic, but basically it talks about the journey to God, and there's 4 levels to it, right? So the first is the journey from the world basically to God, then from God through God, then from God back into the world, right? But then the final level, and this is the highest level you can reach, you walk in the world by God, through God, as in you walk and your footsteps are the footsteps of God. You speak and your speech is the speech of God. Why? Not because you become divine, you're not become, it's not anthropomorphism. But you walk, you do everything that God would want you to do. And how you achieve that, don't ask me, I'll tell you when I get there, inshallah. But it's a journey of spiritual purification, of training yourself. And if we look at the cosmological foundations, last thing, of human beings from an Islamic perspective, human beings have the potential to rise above angels and sink below animals, right? They have the potential to grow and to sink. And so if you deny your lower self, you are able to rise to that higher point where the ruh, the spirit, as we would call it, the Holy Spirit, maybe that's the parallel, inspires you. All right, that is awakened, it's unveiled, and so that is the thing by which you walk and speak and talk, right? And so that's what perhaps this Mullah Sadra is the person who wrote this book, if anyone's interested in reading it. But that's maybe answering your question, maybe not, probably not.
No, that was great, thank you.
It's interesting that kind of parallels a kind of more Kabbalistic Jewish concept, like a very mystical concept, I think, that your soul has multiple levels. There are different mystical texts that have loads of different things to say about it, but one concept is that your like basic level of your soul is the it's called the nefesh habahemit. It's the like animalistic soul, and it's not a bad part of you, but it's the part of you that kind of has impulses and desires and like help you fulfill all your basic needs to stay alive, and that it's something that humans and animals all share, but that humans have higher levels of the soul that you can reach, that you can like have that relationship with God. And there's a concept of like recognizing the element of godliness in each person based on the fact that they've got that higher soul that's effectively a part of God. So I just thought that was a really interesting parallel. But there's something I wanted to bring up based on, I noticed a lot of Raahim's texts were kind of organized around the concept of like selflessness as a necessary part of welcoming the stranger, that you should go above and beyond and do things that maybe don't benefit you personally for that individual. And I just wondered if anyone has any thoughts on the extent to which that's supposed to exist, and the extent to which it's necessary, and also like, is that something that's achievable by everyone, or is it something that you've got to be one of God's like chosen individuals or somebody who's already a great leader in order to achieve that? Open to the floor, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say I'll open that up to anybody who wants to contribute, but it looks like Raahim has something he wants to say first.
No, I want Lizzy to speak first if she has something. Go on, Lizzy.
I'm not sure how much I have really to say about that in terms of, I guess, in terms of a Christian perspective, there's definitely an element of selflessness and about the fact that, you know, God favors the widow who gives away her money more than the rich man who only gives away a small percent of his. I think, I don't know how this works in terms of other faiths, and I don't know how other people feel, but I do think there's also a sense of selfishness in the fact that, you know, the idea that, you know, when you show hospitality, you might be throwing it to the angels, or the sense that this is something we should do because we might get this reward of, and yeah, so I guess there's always that little bit as well about how much of what we do is truly selfless. And I think as human beings, we can't ever be truly selfless. I think from a Christian point of view, we're all called to try to live the best we can, though, and to follow the example that Jesus set, and to try and be disciples of God. So I don't think, from my understanding of my faith, that it can only be certain people who are championing to that. I think we all have the opportunity to do that and the ability. That isn't to say it's easy. And one of the best conversations I ever had with people of faith where we were talking about this, not from a refugee point of view, but how do we welcome people from within our own faith who perhaps have different understandings of their theology and how they treat outsiders, whether that be in terms of their sexuality or their religion. And how do we do that when it's hard, especially if we feel attacked by a characteristic that we think represents us, and just recognizing that we're not Jesus, so we're not perfect. So while we're called to try and follow that example, we're all going to fail. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but that would be kind of what I would think about from my own personal perspective of my faith. But like I said, I recognize that I wouldn't necessarily speak for all Christian voices within that either. And people might have very different opinions to me, and that's fine. And I'm happy for the floor to challenge me and say they have different understandings.
I think where I'm coming from, there's parallels with both of what you've said. In terms of the word nefesh, I think you used is the parallel with nafs in Arabic. So, and we have the same idea with different level of.
You said something that sounded like ruach, which also is a term we would use.
Yeah. So the nafs is the animalistic soul. It's typically described as that, but I'm sure it's more complicated than that, you know, standard definition, that standard translation. But yeah, in the Quran it talks about 3 levels of the soul. The soul that incites to evil, the soul which is where most people are at, the soul which is, you know, self-reprimanding. When you do something wrong, it tells you you've done something wrong, right? But that's the middle, that's like the average. When you go down, you go to the soul that incites to evil, it's telling you what to do, and you don't even know where that you're doing wrong. But then there's one that's higher, which is nafsul mutma'inna, and the one that's at peace. Literally means the one that has tranquility, that has, you know, content. Sometimes it's translated as, it's the one that's content with what God has decreed for you. If bad things come to you, you're like, there is good in this. You know, I'm happy with it, you know, because God's wisdom. So if good things happen to you, you praise God, you thank God. If you feel, you know, it doesn't mean you just stop becoming human. You still feel pain and suffering, but you're content with it because you trust. But that again is reached through levels of years of spiritual purification. I think where I would agree with Lizzy as well is that I think anyone has potential to do that. I think the word of ruh, which and rah, as you mentioned, that is something which is in every human. You said as a part of God, of effectively, you know, philosophically, you know, be careful about using the word part of God having parts, because that becomes a bit problematic. But yes, I would say that God does in the Quran literally, he breathed from his soul into human being, into Adam. So he has that divine spark, right? So there is the potential of each human to manifest that selflessness. And I think everyone has the potential to become a saint. Is there a point of no return? Maybe. I'd argue there is, based on Islamic sources, based on Islamic textual sources. But most people aren't that far gone that they can't come back. Everyone has the potential to be a wali, to be a friend of God, to be a beloved of God. And I think you were asking more, Johnny, about selflessness. It's not right. So I just want to say one thing is there's an Islamic law system, just as the Jewish, you know, Jewish law system. And in that Islamic law system, there's very heavy on rights. On how can we rights? That can also mean obligation. I have a right for you to be X, do X, Y, Z to me. I have a right for my parents to find me a wife, for example. Right? That's my right to my father. But they have a right on me for me to be kind to them, to, you know, look after them and go above and beyond. And if you look at the other way, it's like I'm obligated to be good to them. They're obligated to look after me and provide for me and so on. So when we think of rights, it becomes very selfish sometimes. But when we think about obligations, it can become selfless. If we think of, I like to think of helping. Which is interesting. But yeah, it's not, you have obligations to yourself, to your family. You have to make sure everyone's okay. But if you're willing, if everything is met, all the hukuk, all the rights, all the obligations are met, and you want to sacrifice your right, then that's for you. That's between you and God. You're going above and beyond what you need to do. You don't have to, but do going above and beyond the bare minimum, which is the hukuk, which is Islamic law. Then you're reaching into the realm of saints. That's how you get it. Oh, so they say.
It's interesting, your framing of rights and obligations. So Jewish law doesn't actually have a concept of rights. There's nowhere that it says this is your right. It's these are your obligations meant to do for others, not in terms of what you're meant to gain from others. But one thing I find difficult with that is that I think it's important to understand or to regard others as having rights, in order to have the right level of empathy that you fulfill your obligation. And like, it's important to recognize your own rights and to stand up for them, particularly in a case where, you know, you're also standing up on behalf of others who share those rights but aren't necessarily having them fulfilled. So like, an obvious example would be, for me, I think it's important to stand up for women's reproductive rights, because there are women who don't have those rights in the countries where they live. And that's something that if I'm not able to recognize that as my own right and their right to, you know, determine what they say with their bodies, then I'm not able to, you know, prioritize that. And when other people don't recognize those as human rights, that can like often lead to disagreement that can have real world implications. So yeah, it's something that I struggle with.
I actually wanted to ask if we could backtrack a little bit to something that Chana and Raahim mentioned about ruh or ruach, like the breath of God, and the idea that that is something that is sort of breathed into all living things, because it's a concept that Christianity, I think, has sort of borrowed from Judaism, but that obviously isn't necessarily like understood the same way in Christianity. So I did kind of want to ask specifically Raahim and Chana to talk about that a little bit more, just because like Christianity tend to focus on the idea that humans are made in the image of God, or that humans are children of God, rather than sort of talking about that idea of God literally like breathing life into humanity.
Yeah, really good question. The ruh is one of the most mysterious things in the Quran. The Quran literally says in one of the chapters that you haven't been given knowledge about the ruh except only a little bit. But there are various places in the Quran where it's mentioned, and you can put them together and derive some sort of understanding. But it ultimately is something, I think, which is beyond the capability of the human being to understand, at least in this world, and at least in this realm of existence. The ruh, Jesus, interestingly, is called the Spirit of God. He's called the Ruh Allah in the Quran, right? It means the Spirit of God. And why is he called the Spirit of God? So I think there are a few reasons, few explanations given. Did they just borrow from Christians? Maybe. But also, I think when Jesus is created, the way of Jesus' creation is very unique, right? Obviously, he's born he's the virgin birth is attested to in the Quran. And the fact that he's born, as in God didn't create him as other people create. Everyone has a ruh, like every single human being has a ruh. But because Jesus was specifically, the ruh was specifically, I think the verse of the Quran quotes something, blown into Mary's womb, right? Literally, in a way that isn't done so with other human beings. That's why he specified this takhsis. There's takhsis means like just picking him out as a ruh Allah in a way that no one else has been, except for Adam maybe. And I think the Quran alludes to this, that Adam, the example of Adam, the example of Jesus is like the example of Adam. They were both create. God just said be, and he is, right. He's created from Adam from clay, and Jesus, same with Jesus. And the roof was blown into Mary. But yeah, it's a creative force in some ways. You can understand it's a creative force. Also, when God blows the roof into Adam, he does something specific. So he says, okay, he created the human being, with his hands, quote unquote. What does that mean? That's another discussion. He created the human being, right? And then he says, then he created another creation. And if you look at, he added another layer of creation into that being. But the Barakallahu Ahsanul Khaliqeen, and blessed is God, the best of creators, right? He didn't. So how some people understand it is that when God created the human, Adam, the first human, as in the physical form, but then he added in the ruh, he added in the spiritual dimension, that ability for the human being to have rationality, and through that rationality understand the world, gain knowledge, and to create categories like these, the ability of the human mind affection. And that is what he or she is then tested upon. That if you've been given this intellect that lets you work things out, this is right, that is wrong, you can do this and rise higher, or you can, it's right, it's wrong, and you're still doing it, and you go down. So this, again, it's the same thing. You can rise above angels or go below animals, but depending on how you use that God-given ability, which is, I think, in the ruh. But again, I stand to be corrected, and God knows best.
Yes. Yeah, so the term ruach, again, getting into the whole translation thing, can be translated as spirit or wind or breath, but that's already us trying to understand what it means, and it's possible that there's some level that we never will. But when you think of it in those terms, your breath is something that it's a bit above the physical. It's there, but you can't see it. You can feel it and you can maybe hear it, but it's a bit beyond. And I think that's kind of what the Torah seems to be getting at, when you've got this being created from clay, from the ground, that is then having something extra added to it, and that it's saying that there's something that's distinguishes humanity from the rest of the world and from the other physical beings that are in the world, and whether you see that as an innate feature of humanity, or whether you see that as a responsibility. And again, looking at it in terms of, and relating to the image of God, but also looking at the ruach as potentially a part of God, God in a way giving of God's self, and then existing inside of every human being, that if you view yourself as having an element of godliness inside of you, not in an arrogant way, because everyone else also has that element of godliness, but it makes you act in a certain way, and it makes you introspect, I think. And I think it's an interesting thing that the Torah decides to open with that. It's also in some ways a little bit troubling, the idea of God's breath or the image of God, or we also see places where it talks about God's face or God's back. In Judaism, we're very keen to emphasize that you can't imagine God in a physical form, and you certainly can't represent God in a physical form. And so it's interesting that, and I wonder how much of that is something that's maybe developed over the centuries, and maybe there was a little bit less of that in the time of the Torah, but certainly we're told you cannot create an image of God. And I think it's an interesting parallel between the idea that we in some ways need these personifications of God to try and reach a level of understanding that we can relate to, or that we can learn from, without turning that into something that reduces God to the level of a human. And I think the creation story is a really interesting part of that conversation.
Thank you. I'm aware we're going a little bit over time, so if people need to go, that is totally fine. But I did also kind of want to, bouncing off of that, ask Lizzy and any other Christians hanging around, sort of how we feel about Raahim saying that he's very hesitant to talk about God as being split into parts. Or
I didn't quite catch that one. Didn't make sense. Yeah, I got it.
I think Judaism would probably, like, for the most part, agree with that. Even though we talk about different aspects of God, like, those are not individual aspects. It's not like you've got a little piece of God that's not connected to my little piece of God. It's just something called godliness that we don't understand.
Yeah. And I think also a little bit about, like, Chana talking about how, like, not lowering God to the level of a human, which in Christianity is understood in a very different way. So I was just wondering if anyone, like Lizzy or anyone else who's Christian, wanted to jump in and chat about that.
When I heard you talk about, like, the breath of God, it made me think of the Holy Spirit always straight away, which is also very, like, part of the Trinity in Christianity and very separate, but also is God, which I guess is the weird thing in Christianity, is that they're truly separate things but also the same. I guess, could I ask a question myself that's maybe not related? How is community in your like in Judaism and Islam, the importance of community? How big is that? And, like, I guess I understand it as slightly bigger maybe than in Christianity, because it's such a personal faith, as in, to me, I see it as Jesus kind of took away our sin, and we see it as, like, a very personal thing, whereas I understand, like, the history of Judaism and Islam is very much a part of your religion and who you are, your identity.
I wonder if, like, linked.
Oh, no. Go on.
I wonder if just quickly linked to that, in terms of talking about community, pulling it back to the refugee topic that we're talking about, how does that affect, like, new people in that community or outsiders in that community?
Thank you, Sophie. I think before we go to that, I just want to see if anybody else, because I think Lizzy looked like she might have had something to say. So
Just on the thing about kind of, God into a person, like, aside from the fact that obviously within Christianity Jesus is God, but I have a weird thing where I find it really hard in terms of, when we're not talking about Jesus, when we're talking about God as part of that three separate entities that are one, I think there is an issue with when we try to make God more human than he as well. I think that's where, I mean, even though we're made in the image of God, one of the things I struggle with, though, is I think that that's often used as a way then, because people have their ideas then of what they mean by that. So often it's man, often it's white, even though when we talk about Jesus, he obviously was Middle Eastern, so that in itself is a bit of an issue. And we start to then other groups, and I think that brings it back to the refugees as well, about how then Christianity is used sometimes to essentially support a kind of white supremacist or kind of viewpoint. So I really struggle sometimes with that. I mean, I all fine with the Jesus, but then I tend to compartmentalize in my head, which is weird, of these three separate entities that are God. And I never have a problem with seeing Jesus as the Son of God, but then I have an issue when we try to talk about God or picture God as a being that breathes life into people, into saying that this is what he would look. This is, well, for a start, I fall into the trap of saying he, even though I reject that, because I don't think God has a gender. I think, and I have an issue with the way that then we try and fit God into this box that tends to be very white, very westernized view, which, and then if we are all made in the image of God, then that isn't representative, because we're all made in different images. But I think this is something where I think there's only so much we can grasp within religion, and then perhaps it's what Hannah was saying about how it's about the text trying to help us understand as best we can, with our understanding from a human point of view, something that is more spiritual and perhaps beyond normal comprehension, if that at all makes sense. And the Trinity thing, like I say, I struggle with it when I bring it all together, because in my head I separate it even though it's one of the same. And I don't know if that's how other people from Christian points of view see it as well, but it's very, very tricky and very bitty in the way that I approach it.
Yeah, I think the Trinity can be a really weird thing even for Christians to sort of think about. But yeah, if we want to go back then to Emily's really good question about community and Sophie's little add-on about like, how does this relate to how you treat sort of outsiders for Raahim and Chana? Sorry, this has turned into a little bit of like the Christians interrogate the non-Christians, which can happen when we have a little bit of a Christian majority, but I hope you guys are okay with that.
Okay. Chana, do you want to go first?
In Judaism, it's a religion not so much of doctrine as practice. Like, belief is important. Like, the first commandment given at Sinai was "I am God," but actually, like, in some ways seen as more key is keeping the laws, and we call it halakha. Certainly in Orthodox Judaism, a little bit different for progressive streams, but it's seen as those laws are like something you have to do. And that's because belief is something that can change, it fluctuates, and your relationship with God and with your opinions of all the different laws changes throughout your life, and that's something that's normal and recognized. But Jewish practice still stays the same. And that means that there are things that, you know, I might struggle with, but still have to follow the laws on. For example, in Orthodox Judaism, when we pray in a synagogue, there are certain aspects of the prayers that men can do and women can't. Now, I really fundamentally disagree with that as somebody who wants to be a part of the prayer services and faces discrimination. But I still wouldn't lead those prayer services because I believe that the concept of that law existing and the process through which it has come to exist is still important, as an example. And then a huge number of our laws and rituals are so dependent on existing in a community. And that's come to shape Judaism in a way that it's no longer just a religion. We view ourselves as a nation, as a people, and there is Jewish culture, there's Jewish food, and there's so much about being Jewish that hasn't actually got anything to do with faith or even religious practice and religious law. And a huge number of Jews are irreligious, may define as atheists, may not practice anything, but would still consider Judaism to be a huge and very important part of their identity. And it's something that connects us all from around the world. So if you go anywhere, you find the Jews and you find the thing that connects you. And a lot of that is about practice. So for example, I keep kosher, so I would need to find somewhere that I can get hold of kosher food. And I keep Shabbat, so I need to find people that I can spend the Sabbath with, who are sensitive to that and what that means and what is required. But also when I meet another Jew, it's oh yeah, we got this thing in common. There's this phrase, it's a slang term, we call it bageling, when you try and tell someone you're a Jew without telling them you're a Jew. So you'll be oh yeah, I mean, I look pretty Jewish to anyone who knows, but someone will be oh yeah, I've got to go home from work early on Friday, you know, and then you're oh yeah, you're that person. So yeah, and particularly since the state of Israel was founded, it was founded on the principles that any Jew can go there and call it their home. Interestingly, the way the state of Israel defines Jew for that purpose is somebody who's got a Jewish grandparent, and that was the designation that Hitler decided how to make somebody count as Jewish. So it's primarily there as a place to flee persecution, which is sadly necessary. But I saw something really interesting about a Holocaust survivor in Ukraine who, when she was a child, being Jewish was something you had to hide. And now, as an old woman, being Jewish was like the first thing you wanted someone to know about you, because that meant you could straight away get on a plane, go to Israel, and like know that you had a safe landing, and know that you had somewhere that was going to take you in, and that you could be legally, and you weren't going to be sent back. Yeah, and in terms of how that affects non-Jewish refugees, it does vary from community to community. So you get a lot of like particularly Hasidic communities that ideology is very strongly influenced by the Holocaust, and to the extent that they've become extremely insular, resistant to anything coming from the outside, anything that involves change or that might affect the way that they live their lives. And therefore there's a big distrust of anyone who is not from their community, Jews and otherwise. And I think that affects how people relate to others. But likewise, there are other communities for whom helping others and helping refugees is such an important part of who they are. And there's something that distinguishes like Orthodox and progressive Jewish communities, again generalizing like hugely here, but like progressive, for example, Reform communities, because a lot of people who are less involved with like religious practice, or maybe don't put as much emphasis on it, the things that they unite around as a community are like the more like value-driven things. So they'll do a lot, like often those communities are really, really good at doing outreach work, and working with people from poor communities, or working with refugees, that kind of thing. And I just wanted to address also what Lizzy was saying about the like white supremacy image of God as a white man. So that's like certainly that whole like God as an old white man with a long white beard is like something that Judaism would view as like problematic, that you've created a physical image of God. But I think that's something that comes from Western art being so like prominent in the world, and like it is easier to relate to like a visual image and to see that as like your obvious thing. And like Western art has its own roots in like sexism and racism and all of that has turned God into a white man. But I think it's important to distinguish between like God and discrimination. Like there are plenty of people who use God as an excuse for discriminating against others, whether that's white supremacists, or currently in Israel, they've just elected a government that has like one of the parties that makes up the coalition is they call themselves the religious Zionist group, and included among them are some like literal fascists, like people who have openly like made homophobic comments or racist comments against Arab citizens, and like really like things that to me are so antithetical to my Judaism and my understanding of it, despite the fact I certainly consider myself religious and a Zionist, but like I cannot like equate their politics with my experience of Judaism at all. And they're using it as an excuse because it seems to give them divine backing, I suppose, is what you would say. But that evil is something, and I would call it evil, is something that is, I think, the worst of humanity, and that they have tried to disguise it as something from God. Yeah.
About the questions. Sorry.
Okay, so yeah, sorry, because
We can ask any more
Hannah
questions.
had said so many really cool things.
I want to say so many things about that, but I know we're also short of time.
Yeah, I think because we probably could go on forever, if not stopped. And I know I at least have people in my house who are hiding because I am in a work call. If everyone's okay, I think we might end it here. If anybody's got any final questions that can be answered quickly, feel free to ask them, but I think we might sort of wrap it up.
I can answer quickly the question that Emily asked. So into the community, I think there's a saying of peace be upon him, which gives you the answer in like a few sentences, and I'm paraphrasing it, so excuse me. But it says that the Ummah, the Muslim community, that it is very central to Islam. It's like a body, right? When one part of the body is sick or is hurt, the entire body suffers because of it. And I think there's a similar idea of you are all part of the body of Christ or something in the Bible. You probably understand it in a different way, but very much so. It's an ideal. There's a difference between ideals and what the reality is on the ground. Sometimes it's for the personal levels of, spirituality or religious practice not being there. Sometimes it's because of the socioeconomic condition that we don't, because we're all struggling ourselves, or we don't have the means, or we don't have the awareness. We might not be at the ideal, but that's the idea of the Prophet said, was that you should be like that. You should be someone who, and when someone on the other, when a neighbor is struggling, when a Muslim shouldn't go to sleep with his full stomach when a neighbor is Muslim or non-Muslim for that matter is hungry, right? That kind of idea is found throughout Islamic teaching, and Islam very much started off as in the early days, a movement for the oppressed, a movement for those who are disenfranchised by society, the slaves, the women. So that's why the majority of the early converts weren't very rich people, they're very weak people in society. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount of community at the center of Islam, and as a Muslim, I try to make sure that we put more emphasis on it instead of internal bickering or external bickering. I think active community action within our communities and within interfaith communities is the way forward.
Oh, that was a really nice way to wrap it up. Oh, sorry, Emily.
No, thank you for answering that. That was really good.
Thanks, everyone.